Good evening, Anthony. I'm looking forward to discussing giraffe conservation with you and understanding what species of giraffes there are across the African continent and which ones we need to be focusing on from a conservation perspective.
Yes, and I'd like to orient it very specifically towards the reticulated giraffe. There are several populations that need conservation, but I think the difference in the case of the reticulated giraffe is that not only are there the usual conservation concerns, but there's a kind of a psychological problem involved in that people, including people who are generally enthusiastic about giraffes, may not have grokked, as it were, exactly what the reticulated giraffe is and why there are certain special problems in appreciating it for what it is that affect its conservation prospects. So I would say that one of the main challenges in the case of the reticulated giraffe is a framing challenge. We need to reframe that animal in order to see what it really is and how a particular hybridisation problem is affecting it more than other forms of giraffe.
Right, and the reticulated giraffe is not as well known generally, would you say, as the giraffe you'll encounter on the Serengeti or in the Kruger National Park. And it's because it's quite a bit rarer and isolated to a few reserves, is that right?
Yes, well, I think the main reason why the reticulated giraffe has a fairly high public image is because it just looks so different from other giraffes. And you know, it's fairly well photographed in places like Samburu, Buffalo Springs, and Meru in Kenya, near the base of Mount Kenya. But most of its range is actually remote and very difficult for tourists to visit. And so it's a giraffe that's relatively hard to see in the wild. And the fact that it's reported to be present in many zoos around the world also muddies the whole picture, because on the surface of it, you'd think that many zoos have reasonable breeding populations of the reticulated giraffe, but when you look into it, you find that all of them are hybridized. And so the fundamental problem you have to clear up even before you start talking about conserving the real McCoy, the real reticulated giraffe, is you have to see through the misguiding labeling of certain populations, partly in zoos and partly on the Laikipia Plateau in Kenya, mislabeling as the reticulated giraffe. There's no zoo in the world that has a breeding population of purebred reticulated giraffes, and there probably never will be, because all of the stock has been compromised by hybridization in zoos. And the best conserved population of what is called the reticulated giraffe, which is on the Laikipia Plateau in Kenya, is not actually the reticulated giraffe. It is a hybrid between the reticulated giraffe and Rothschild's giraffe, which occurs to the west of the natural range of the reticulated giraffe. And that mislabeling may prove lethal to the conservation prospects of the actual real reticulated giraffe because of a false sense of complacency. And the reason why that complacency matters is that most, 90-something% of the actual original range of the reticulated giraffe is in a part of Kenya that is very difficult to govern. It's effectively part of Somalia and Somaliland, in the sense that it's a kind of a remote outback where there's only nominal control by the government, the police, and the army of Kenya. It's essentially Somali run, and the Somalis are not known for their respect for wildlife. And so in the longer term, there's little prospect for the conservation of the actual real reticulated giraffe in the heartland of its original range, unless people make a pretty determined effort. And that in turn will only come about if people really understand what's at stake, and they see past the rather distracting and misleading appellation and labeling of certain hybrid populations as the reticulated giraffe.
Right, and the reticulated giraffe is remarkable for its how distinctive it is in coloration, and we've been discussing how that coloration is potentially related to the habitat that it occurs in. The hybrid population is unlikely to prevail in the long term as well, I would have thought, in that main reticulated giraffe habitat in the dry arid regions of Kenya. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. I mean, imagine, for example, let's just paint a brief geographical picture. Okay, so the reticulated giraffe is indigenous to the drier parts of Kenya, which is like the northeastern, say, half of Kenya. Now, somewhat to the west of that, on higher lying and more well-watered land, just west of Mount Kenya, there's something more like a savanna plateau, as opposed to the original, the real range of the reticulated giraffe, which is semi-arid to arid, shall we say, thicket and woodland, right? And on this rather mesic plateau, which is not representative of the real habitat of the reticulated giraffe because it's cooler and moister, this is where the main hybrid population occurs. And the mistake that's been made, I mean, the fact that hybrid population is there on the Laikipia ranches and game and livestock properties is thoroughly laudable. The private landowners on the Laikipia Plateau have done a stunning job of conserving the giraffe there. The mistake that's been made is that they've called it the reticulated giraffe. And that labeling can make all the difference because it is not the reticulated giraffe. It is a hybrid involving the reticulated giraffe, but it's not the real thing. And so if it were to come to pass that all of the other populations in the real heartland of the reticulated giraffe were exterminated owing to the Somali lawlessness and lack of respect for wildlife, and then people tried to reintroduce the species from the Laikipia into that arid heartland, I can't say whether it would succeed or not. It might or it might not. There might be enough climatic tolerance in the hybrid to get back into the arid zone, but it's not what conservation should be about. What you want to do as a priority is you want to conserve the real McCoy, because the reticulated giraffe is not just a valid form of giraffe that deserves to be conserved in its pure form. It is categorically different from all other giraffes. Now, let's just stand back a little. Many people to this day who are thoroughly interested in giraffes and somewhat expert in them still believe something quite absurd, and that is that there's only one kind of giraffe, of which there are several subspecies. One species of giraffe, of which the reticulated giraffe is merely a subspecies. That is absurd, and one can only believe that if you are unobservant of giraffes. Lots of people love giraffes and would like to conserve them, but they haven't actually looked at them. When you actually look at the giraffes, it becomes very clear that there are at least 3 species of giraffes, and probably 4, and that the reticulated giraffe is a species in its own right. The fact that it hybridizes with another species to the west does not alter the fact that it is a species in its own right. So once you understand that, then you go to the next level of consciousness, which is to realize that not only is it a species of giraffe in its own right, it is by far the most distinctive species, to the point of being categorically different from all other giraffes in certain ways. And the main ways in which it's categorically different from giraffes, and this is not a complete list, is its coloration is categorically different. And then its habitat is categorically different because it's a giraffe that is specially adapted to remarkably tall and dense vegetation in a remarkably dry place. And then thirdly, it may prove to have behavioral features and characteristics that distinguish it from other giraffes. This requires research, but the research won't be done unless we have a search image. So
right.
It's if it were not for this unfortunate hybridization on the western edge of the distribution of the reticulated giraffe, people would have realized much sooner how distinctive it is. But that hybridization has fooled people into thinking that it's just a subspecies. So we're
in a very dangerous situation as conservationists, in that one of the most iconic species on the planet is potentially on the brink of extinction here, but no one realizes it. Is that what you're saying, Anthony?
Well, it's not quite that dire. It's not quite that dire, because there still are some populations in the Somali-controlled part of Kenya, but we could lose them very rapidly because there's no real control over those populations. All it would take is a little bit of exacerbation of lawlessness plus a big drought, and we could, in fact, I haven't kept track of recent events, but we may have already lost most of those animals in recent times. So there's no decent conservation area anywhere within the heartland of the range of the reticulated giraffe, and unless we need to do something about that. We need to create and defend at least one decent conservation area in the actual heartland of the reticulated giraffe, not on its periphery where it's subject to hybridization.
Yeah. So giraffe conservationists are resting on their laurels, so to speak, because of the Laikipia population. And the true the Laikipia population being a hybrid and therefore not actually worthy of conservation in the same way as the true reticulated giraffe is. And reticulated giraffes are, as you say, seen in zoos around the world. But my impression is that most people, casual wildlife enthusiasts, would be hard pressed to describe how the reticulated giraffe differs from a giraffe they would see in elsewhere in Africa, in the Serengeti or the Kruger Park. So perhaps what we could do for listeners is to describe what to look out for, and then once you have that framing, it's incredibly clear what a remarkable animal this reticulated giraffe is, and how distinct it is from other giraffes.
Yes, well, the easiest introduction to this distinctiveness is the following: that most giraffes, and we're talking about 3 of the 4 species, have a pale matrix or ground color upon which are painted darker blotches and spots. Now that's a remarkable coloration, because it's hard to think of any other ungulate that has that. But that is sort of taken for granted even at nursery school level as the coloration pattern of giraffes. When you sketch or do a painting of a giraffe, you basically create the outline, and then you understand that the basic shade of the animal is pale, and then on it you paint darker blotches. And everybody understands at some fundamental level that can be interpreted as camouflage coloration. We can discuss the ways in which that is subject to caveats and so on, but let's just go with that for now. Now, where the reticulated giraffe is categorically different, it's not just another nuance of that kind of giraffe. It is categorically different because in the reticulated giraffe, the ground color is dark, and it is the overlay, the stuff that's been painted on it, that is pale. And what's been painted on that dark background is a tracery or a network of crisp, pale markings. It looks as if the reticulated giraffe has been dipped in a muddy color or an ochreish color, a liverish color, and then a fishing net soaked in whitewash has been chucked over it. That's the way it looks. And so the difference is that your conventional giraffe is pale with dark markings. The reticulated giraffe is dark with pale markings. Moreover, those pale markings are different in the sense that they form a definite network effect, which you don't really see in other giraffes. And what's fascinating about this psychologically, the reason you haven't heard, listeners will not have heard this stated as clearly as we're trying to state it here, is that it's subject to a certain perceptual phenomenon called a Gestalt switch. So a Gestalt switch is where you take a single pattern and simply shift it quantitatively, but with a qualitative effect. One of the most familiar images of this is the image where there's two vases, or sorry, one vase, and depending on your perceptual setting, you can see it as a vase, or you can see it as two faces facing each other, right? And the point is that what's funny about the human mind is you can only see one of those interpretations at a time. You can switch from one to the other on a minute-to-minute or second-to-second basis, but the mind can't hold both perceptions at once. And so you can visualize the reticulated giraffe as being an animal with a pale ground color or matrix, in which the dark blotches have become so extensive and so tightly integrated that all that's left is this white network. But it's equally valid to look at it as an animal that has basically switched. It's not just an animal in which the pale matrix has retreated to being equivalent to a pale network. It is actually a giraffe that, to all intents and purposes, is dark with a pale tracery of markings that, furthermore, is unique. There's no other animal on land, as far as I know, in any order of mammals that has anything like that can be put in the same category as the reticulated giraffe, in the sense that it has a dark overall color and then a network, a netting of crisp, pale markings extending basically across the whole body. There's nothing else like that. And this is not just a trivial, arbitrary stretching of a point, because if we accept that the coloration of giraffes is adaptively significant, adaptively valuable, then the question arises, why is the giraffe that lives in the acacia comifera woodlands of the northeastern half of Kenya so different from other giraffes in its adaptive coloration? And the answer to that seems to be that it's the only semi-desert adapted giraffe that happens to live in a semi-desert that is densely wooded. So let me go on a little tangent to explain that. There are at least two other forms of giraffe across Africa that venture into remarkably arid territory. One is the Sahara giraffe, which now survives only in Niger, in the Sahel in Niger. And the other one is the western form of the southern African giraffe that lives both at the edge of the Namib Desert and in the nearly barren, driest southwestern part of the Kalahari. And what's different about those two arid adapted giraffes is that they live in relatively open vegetation, and that they are paler than the giraffes associated normally with mesic savannas, such as in the Kruger Park, the Serengeti, and so on. So we know that giraffes can live in remarkably dry places. In the case of the form in Namibia, often photographed in such stark arid landscapes that there's not a tree in sight. There's not even a bush in sight. It just seems to be an animal wandering through a hilly desert. And the same was probably true formerly on the southern edge of the Sahara, where the animal was exterminated too early for us ever to get photographs of it in that habitat. But you see, that doesn't prepare you for the reality of the reticulated giraffe, because the reticulated giraffe lives in equally arid environments. For example, near Garissa in eastern Kenya, the average annual rainfall is only about 80 millimeters per year, which is basically a desert rainfall. And yet that animal is associated with tall, dense vegetation, a kind of a thorny, twiggy, rather bare and dry-looking woodland, consisting mainly of the genera Vachelia and Comifera, with Comifera being bare and leafless for most of the year, every year. And it hides in amongst this kind of vegetation in a way that cannot be done in the case of the other two arid adapted forms of giraffe. And so not only is it adaptive coloration categorically or qualitatively different from those of other giraffes, but its relationship to vegetation seems to fit that as well. So it makes it into an adaptive syndrome. And if you lose the reticulated giraffe through a false complacency at the success of conserving its hybrids, you're actually losing that whole adaptive package. You're losing the whole shebang. You're losing the animal and its unique adaptation and that whole relationship as well.
Right. And that hybrid, how does the hybrid differ in terms of coloration? And the argument here is that the hybrid would not be nearly as well adapted as in that Commiphora Facellia forest, and so may not have longevity in such a habitat, coming back to that original question of mine. But how stark is the difference between the coloration of the hybrid versus the pure form? Because I think what I found really fascinating in thinking through this topic is the reticulated giraffe is, at first glance, seems to be a giraffe of normal coloration, but it's just a completely different coloration. It's switched to be a different looking animal, but I don't think most people realize that. So what does the hybrid look like in comparison?
Well, to appreciate what the hybrid looks like, let's first review the taxonomic labeling of the hybrid, and then let's review what the form of giraffe is with which the reticulated giraffe has hybridized on the Laikipia Plateau. Okay, so the other party that's concerned here is called Rothschild's giraffe.
Right.
So the reticulated giraffe is Giraffa reticulata, and Rothschild's giraffe is a different species, Giraffa camelopardalis, subspecies Rothschildi. And Rothschild's giraffe is well celebrated and well known, even by laypersons, for two main reasons. Number one is it is well represented in the zoos of the world. It happens to be, for historical reasons, to be well represented in zoos on several continents. And the other one is that the Kenyan authorities have been remarkably successful in bringing Rothschild's giraffe back from the brink, back from a very dwindled population into what is now a steadily growing, successful reintroduction of this subspecies, Rothschild's giraffe, into something approaching 10 different areas in East Africa now. So we need not go into those various areas. The best known of them is Nakuru National Park. But having characterized the Rothschild's giraffe, let's now look at what is different about its coloration and other aspects of its body relative to the reticulated giraffe. Now, before we go into coloration, what is immediately noticeable when you compare photographs is that the Rothschild's giraffe has a proportionately shorter neck. That's a major thing for a giraffe. One's antennae should go out immediately on seeing that, because it's consistent with the idea that you're talking about different species, not just different subspecies, as many giraffe aficionados still believe today. Okay, so Rothschild's giraffe is, to my mind, certainly a different species from the reticulated giraffe, and that's apparent even in the proportions of the body as manifest by the proportionately short neck of Rothschild's giraffe. Then coming to the more superficial aspects known as its adaptive coloration, the first thing you'll notice about Rothschild's giraffe is that the whole lower half of the legs is spotless and pale. It's what I call a pedal flag. So a giraffe can be largely camouflage colored with a blotching pattern, but it can still have a conspicuously pale feature or set of features on the anatomy, which can be used to facilitate gregariousness in what is essentially a gregarious and social animal, because the movement of the legs in many vegetational settings is accentuated by a conspicuous pallor on the legs. And so you can instantly recognize a picture of Rothschild's giraffe in a place like Nakuru National Park, because just look for the legs. There's a remarkably extensive, pale, spotless tract all the way from the carpals down to the hoofs, and on the hind legs as well, from the hocks down. Then if you really get your eye in, you'll see that the basic blotching or spotting pattern is also different, because in Rothschild's giraffe, it's very clearly a pale animal with darker blotches and spots. Okay, so those are the two main things. Those are the two main things to look out for. So when you see photographs taken on the Laikipia plateau, which are widely labeled, even by careful and phylogenetically minded scientists and naturalists, as the reticulated giraffe, you can immediately see that it's not true, because many or most of those individuals in those hybrid populations have got both pale and conspicuously spotless lower legs, and a general pattern in which you would never really describe it as being netted in the same way as the pure reticulated giraffe. So two things have been compromised. The genuine article, the real McCoy reticulated giraffe, has nondescript brownish lower legs. You don't notice them. There's nothing noticeable about them. One just takes them in without ever focusing on them, because they're just not remarkable in any way. And secondly, what the eye sees instead in the reticulated giraffe is this remarkable and unique network of pale traceries on a liverish colored background. Okay, now when you look at the hybrids, both of those things have been compromised. You've now got this paleness creeping in on the lower legs, and you've also got a broadening of the white markings that bring it closer towards the conventional kindergarten concept of the giraffe being a pale animal with dark markings on it. And if you look at the heads, the horn conformation in the reticulated giraffe to the trained eye is also quite different from that in the Rothschild's giraffe. So when you look at the heads in detail, you'll also see that there are differences, and the hybrids conform to an intermediate between the reticulated giraffe and Rothschild's giraffe.
Right, and if one Googles reticulated giraffe and you click on images, many of them do have these pale legs. So there's just a mislabeling across the internet as well, which probably further confuses matters.
Yes, well, there's two problems here. Okay, one is a mislabeling problem, which is essentially a psychological problem rather than a biological problem. But there is also a second problem, which is a biological problem. Now, let's first of all talk about the biological problem before coming back to that psychological problem. The biological problem is that, unfortunately, the reticulated giraffe, although a valid and distinctive species, does actually hybridize with the adjacent species. Not only with the Rothschild's giraffe to the west, but also with the Maasai giraffe to the south. For example, in Tsavo National Park, close to Mombasa. That is not a particular problem, because that hybrid zone is poorly developed. And there's also a possibility that in former times the reticulated giraffe also hybridized with another form of giraffe, which was also a subspecies of Giraffa camelopardalis in southeastern Sudan and southern Ethiopia, although we have no real evidence of that today. But anyway, the point is that what seems to be misleading everybody is that if it were true, according to the textbook concept of species, the textbook concept of species is that there's reproductive isolation. Whether it's because of geographical isolation or because of behavioral differences, one expects from a textbook point of view a distinctive species not to hybridize with adjacent species. Unfortunately, the reticulated giraffe does do that. I can't explain why it does that, but it does do that. And so it's paradoxical to claim that the reticulated giraffe is clearly a separate species, and yet to accept that it seems to be perfectly happy to hybridize with Rothschild's giraffe and to some degree with the Maasai giraffe. That conundrum throws people out and saps our resolve to do everything it takes to conserve the real reticulated giraffe in its politically challenging setting in the Somali-controlled parts of Kenya. Because we feel, well, maybe it is a separate species and maybe it isn't. The hybrid zone indicates that, well, maybe it isn't, But what I would remind people is don't focus on the hybrid zone because we don't understand biology nearly well enough to know what a real species needs to, which criteria apply to the qualification of a real species as a real species. There's lots of, put it this way, there's an idealized concept in textbooks of a species that's based on this ideal situation that it doesn't hybridize with others. But the real world is much messier than that. And it's perfectly possible for there to be a real valid species that also has a hybrid zone with species around it. And that seems to be the case in the reticulated giraffe. But I would encourage conservationists to keep coming back to the central and most important fact. And that is that in its unhybridized form, as still seen today in places like Wajir and Garissa in eastern Kenya, in this remarkably tall and dense vegetation of Vachelia and Comifera in a remarkably dry climate, the animal is thoroughly distinctive and has a consistent appearance. It's very easy to identify the reticulated giraffe as such because it's very distinctive. You have to be very unobservant not to see its distinctive features. And so
right.
put aside that, please put aside that hybrid zone. I'm enthusiastic about that hybrid zone. I think it's wonderful that the Laikipia private landowners have done such a great job of conserving that animal. I don't think it should be exterminated. I think it's a wonderful thing to conserve in its own right, but please don't confuse those hybrids with the real reticulated giraffe, because the penalty or the poor consequence for that will be that we might wake up in a few decades' time and suddenly realize, by God, we've lost the reticulated giraffe. It slipped away right in front of our eyes because we didn't know how to distinguish between a laudable but unsatisfactory success in conserving the hybrids and a politically much tougher challenge in conserving the real McCoy in its real habitat in a part of the world that we, to this day, have very little control over.
Yes. To lose such a wonderful, remarkable, distinctive species would be a true tragedy. Understanding how this animal is adapted into those forests in the deserts is a fascinating thought journey. We discussed it a bit. Perhaps listeners would be interested in our theorizing on why that white net across the body is likely to be adaptive in that environment.
Yes, okay, so let's remind listeners of the following. In the two other arid adapted forms of giraffe, and to get a bit technical here, we're talking about Giraffa camelopardalis peralta, which is the Saharan giraffe. It used to occur right across the Sahara until the current phase of aridity altered the Sahara into an uninhabitable zone. It still occurred in the Sahel widely until several decades ago, but now it occurs in only one population, and that is in the southwestern part of the country of Niger. It still exists, but it's on the brink. Now, that's one of the arid adapted forms of giraffe. So you can call it the Sahara giraffe if you like, Giraffa camelopardalis peralta. The other arid adapted form of the giraffe is the one that you find in Namibia and southwestern Botswana. That is Giraffa angolensis. They're both arid adapted, which means that they both today or formerly lived in essentially treeless, barren-looking desert edge or semi-desert environments. And that condition, that relationship in which a giraffe stalks or walks through a stark, almost moonscape kind of environment, is very well documented in lovely photographs taken in Kaokaland and Damaraland in northwestern Namibia. There's plenty of evidence of this animal, which fortunately still survives in reasonable populations in that part of Namibia. People never got round to exterminating it there. So the point about those giraffes, once you realize that they are semi-arid adapted, or even somewhat, you could call them desert adapted animals, is that number one, they live in largely treeless environments, and number two, their coloration has been modified in a way that's understandable relative to that treelessness, because both of them are pale giraffes. They're like giraffes that have taken a basic ancestral pattern of camouflage coloration and subjected it to the usual trend that desert animals tend to be pale. And so you can make a reasonable argument that both of these giraffes have a major function of coloration that is self-announcement. They're no longer really trying to hide as much as, it's a contextual thing, because they can still hide at night, or they can hide if they find a little copse of trees, or maybe they can hide in a canyon somewhere. But the point is that a lot of the time, these two arid adapted giraffes, one in the northern half of Africa, one in the southern half of Africa, are essentially so exposed that they've abandoned all attempts to hide, and their coloration reflects that by being so subject to paling, that they stand out as much as they blend in. Does that make sense? And I could go into the differences.
Absolutely.
We could go into the differences between the northern one and the southern one, but that's a minor detail. All right. So now we come to the reticulated giraffe, which is equally arid adapted, but has got none of that pallor. There's nothing about it that reflects the usual expectation of an animal in a desert environment to be pale. Indeed, if anything, it's one of the darkest of giraffes, with an interesting proviso, and that is that it seems to me that unlike all other giraffes, the mature males are not subject to melanism. This is a little digression I'd like to take listeners on, because it supports the idea that there's something distinctive about the reticulated giraffe beyond the reticulated pattern. In most giraffes, the mature males have a tendency to go blackish, and they also stink when they're in that masculine display condition. So they make themselves conspicuous with darkness, melanization, and they also give off very noticeable odors. In South Africa, these masculine giraffes are called stink bulls. Now, as far as we know, if anybody has a photograph that proves me wrong, please show it to us. As far as we know, that does not happen in the reticulated giraffe. It just seems to be that the males are somewhat darker than the females, perhaps, but they don't seem to have this melanization phase in the masculine course of life. All right. So in the reticulated giraffe, you've got several things different from both of the other arid adapted giraffes. Firstly, you've got a fundamentally different kind of a pattern, a pale on dark pattern. Secondly, you've got no pallor, no lip service to an arid environment in the form of an overall paling. And thirdly, what you've got, as far as we can make out, is no real tendency to venture out into the open in the way that you see in the Sahara and in the deserts of southern Africa. The reticulated giraffe seems to insist on being among trees, and that makes sense because that acacia comifera woodland of northeastern Kenya is a remarkably tall and dense vegetation for its rainfall quantity. And furthermore, I suspect, this is just a suspicion, I can't give you any data for it, but we know that in the case of the Maasai giraffe, in places like Nairobi National Park, the Serengeti National Park, Amboseli, and so on, the animals live mainly in open savanna, where a lot of their forage plants are relatively low vachellia shrubs like the whistling thorn. So it's very common in Kenya and Tanzania to see giraffes standing around, perfectly obvious because they're taller than the shrubs around them. It's technically a savanna, but it's more like a shrub savanna than a tree savanna. And the normal way that the females forage is with their necks horizontal, differing from the kind of kindergarten expectation that giraffes evolved so they could feed in the top of the trees. The males do that, but the females habitually forage with their necks horizontal. And that's because they're perfectly at home in an environment that's vegetated. It's a savanna, but it's more like a shrub savanna than a tree savanna. And as you go into the real woodlands of Central Africa, for example, in Zambia and certain parts of Tanzania, giraffes drop out completely. There's a vast area of actual woodland in South Central Africa that's completely devoid of giraffes and always has been, because giraffes in general do not like trees. This is one of the fundamental myths of giraffes. Because people understand that one of the functions of the neck extension of giraffes is to get them high and into the tree foliage where no other herbivores can compete with them, at least not ungulate ones. It's very easy to slide from that into a false assumption that trees and giraffes go together. In general, show me a giraffe and I'll show you an environment that is somewhat open.
Okay.
And okay, so I put it to you that I would put it this way. I would like to give researchers, naturalists, and aficionados a new search image when it comes to the reticulated giraffe. Firstly, that it doesn't do that. It sticks to the tall, dense vegetation as much as it can. And secondly, that the females in its case do not have that pattern of foraging with their necks horizontal. I suspect that in the case of the reticulated giraffe, the females and the males both forage with their necks erect, differing fundamentally in a biological sense from, for example, the Maasai giraffe, and that their sexual segregation or the sexually based niche difference in their foraging ecology is based more on a choice of species. I don't know that. I'm just guessing based on considerable experience with giraffes in my research history. So one of the comments I'd make here is that a lot of the things that we need to grok about the reticulated giraffe come down to search images. And you need to think deeply about the animal and frame it in a bunch of different ways in order to come up with relevant search images. Those search images may prove to bear fruit, or they may prove to be duds. But we can't really appreciate what a reticulated giraffe is until we have formulated clear search images and, to some degree, formulated clear terms of description. And an example of a descriptive term that I'm introducing into the discussion here to try and help with the psychological problem of recognizing the qualitative or categorical distinctiveness of the reticulated giraffe is this term called gestalt switch. So when you go from most giraffes to the reticulated giraffe, the change in the pattern constitutes a gestalt switch. And a gestalt switch is essentially a psychological phenomenon because it relates to a situation where the pattern itself has simply been shifted quantitatively, but the effect in the eyes of the viewer is qualitative, categorical. You've got a new kind of giraffe, and that matters. And now to come to the, I think the point that you've been waiting for me to make, which is that it answers the question: how does this white network on the reticulated giraffe actually function once you accept that this particular kind of giraffe is wedded in a rather tight way to tall, dense vegetation of Vachelia and Comifera? And this is how the argument goes. Is it a good time to describe this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing to understand is that both giraffes and their major predators, like the lion and the spotted hyena, have a different kind of visual system from us. And that is that their visual system is much less tuned into color. It's much less tuned into a central focus. They don't have a fovea on their retina as we do. And it's much more tuned into motion. So they're very motion sensitive. They see in black and white and gray. And that combination allows them to see much better at night than we do. Okay, so you have to see the world through giraffe eyes. And when you understand that the reticulated giraffe hides among relatively tall and dense vegetation in a desert, then you have to also consider how the motion sensitivity affects its camouflage. And this is the part that's never been suggested before. Most vegetation sways to some degree in the breeze, and the climate around Wajir and Garissa in eastern Kenya is downright windy for much of the year. And that's very distracting to the eyes of a predator, because the eyes of carnivora are so motion sensitive that what appears to us to be a gentle and innocuous movement of the branches in the wind, to them is I suppose you could call it maddening white noise. When I say noise, obviously I'm talking about visual noise, as it were. But it's very distracting to them, because it makes it harder for the carnivore to scan the environment to look for the giraffe. And so what the giraffe does is it takes a kind of an emulation of the branchwork pattern of these largely bare and thorny trees, and it paints it over its body, and then hides behind the movement of the branches. And so it's being screened. It does constitute camouflage, but it's a kind of a dynamic camouflage that's not really intuitively appreciated by humans with our particular visual emphasis. So it's not that the reticulated giraffe is just painting itself with a traditional camouflage, like a soldier in a jungle war where they have these blotchy uniforms on. That's just typical camouflage, and it operates statically. As long as the soldier remains stock still, then his outline is broken up by that disruptive pattern, and we understand that very well. But that's not what's happening according to this hypothesis in the case of the reticulated giraffe. It's not trying to invoke that kind of camouflage. What it's trying to invoke is a camouflage in which, given that its white network emulates the general pattern of branches, twigs, and thorns, and given the motion sensitivity of the visual systems of its carnivores, it hides behind it hides behind plants that to our human eyes are completely transparent to it. Okay, so imagine you're looking at a reticulated giraffe somewhere near Garissa in eastern Kenya, and you can see it perfectly well, 40, 50 meters from the road, because although it's in amongst a whole bunch of acacias and comiferas, vachelias and comiferas, those plants are bare enough and sticky and twiggy and drought deciduous enough that it's perfectly plain that there's a giraffe there, even if it's standing perfectly still, because that's how our human eyes work. But if you're a lion or a spotted hyena, you look there and you don't see the giraffe, because you're looking for motion. And not only is the giraffe standing still, but the plants around and in front of it, around and in front of it are moving most of the time, even if only slightly in the breeze. And so the idea there is that that animal has invoked a different kind of camouflage. And if this is true, then you see you have a beautiful congruence between the categorical distinctiveness of the netted pattern in the reticulated giraffe and a particular adaptive function that makes that takes the pattern from something that's just idiosyncratic, quirky, and happenstance to something that's thoroughly adaptive. Now, this is all just hypothesizing, but the point is that unless we have search images and hypotheses, we can never advance our thinking about how to be a giraffe and our understanding of the adaptive significance of what could otherwise be seen as rather superficial shifts and variations in the genus Giraffa. Does that make any sense?
It does, and I'm just trying to imagine being a hyena or a lion looking through these comiferas and vachelias, trying to pick out the giraffe, and it's the comiferas and vachelias that are waving in the wind, making it very uncomfortable for the lion or hyena to look through these moving leaves and branches. But I think you're of the view that if they took long enough, they could edit out the leaves and the twigs moving and see the giraffe. Is that would you agree with that? But it's mental energy that's required to do that, and because they're on the move and they can't stare at each moving tree, they opt not to do that, and that's why the camouflage works.
Well, yes, it all comes down to the concept of scanning. What
Yeah.
many predators do is they scan. And when you're scanning, almost by definition, you're taking in a superficial view of a large vista. And you're looking for that little telltale sign. If a human being scans, we can spot a giraffe because our visual system can actually observe it as a figure, and it can observe its outline, even if it's completely stationary. That's how we scan. But when these carnivora scan, their visual system is specialized for motion. And so they're looking for motion. And if there's something that gets in the way of motion detection and makes that form of scanning less efficient, it matters because time is of the essence. The whole idea behind scanning is you scan and move on. You scan and move on. That's what scanning is, as opposed to detailed and lingering scrutiny. And so it's all a time game. It's all a time game. That's how camouflage basically works. It's all a time game. If there's a tiger hiding behind tall, dense grass in Ranthambore National Park, and you were to stay there long enough and scrutinize that patch hard enough, you would probably see it. Whereas in many cases, you'll go past it because scanning leads you to miss it. It's all about that. It's all a time game. So it doesn't need to be an absolute thing. But what we are invoking here is that it doesn't pay the predator to scrutinize for so long that it would penetrate that visual defense. And also, we're invoking a kind of a failure on the part of the mind or the brain of the carnivore to edit the image in the way that goes on all the time in visual systems. So, for example, this may be getting into the weeds a little, but everybody knows that when you're taking a photograph of a whitewashed building and you're on the porch and you snap off a photo of a whitewashed building that looks perfectly normal to you, very often when you get the color photo back, you'll see that the shady parts of the whitewash are remarkable and surprising blue because they're reflecting the color of the sky. But you didn't see that when you were in the situation because your eye edited it out. And it's only when you see a photo where your mind settings don't automatically edit it out because it's now a photo, it's a different context, that you suddenly see that what appears to be just gray shade on a whitewashed wall is actually blue. So there's a lot of editing going on, and the visual systems and the brains of the carnivora are also editing things out and presumably trying to eliminate the distraction of the moving plant parts to try and in a way penetrate that by editing. But you see, because their visual systems are so specialized, they can't actually manage to edit it out, at least not efficiently, at least not in a rapid and sustainable way that enables them to overcome this, what I might call dynamic camouflage on the part of the giraffe. And if people want to understand what that feels like, imagine that if you're a normal human with normal red-green color vision, excuse the minor percentage of people who have typical color blindness because they don't perceive red and green, or at least not the contrast between red and green. Imagine looking at a beautiful bush of roses in which you've got lovely red blooms on a green foliage background, okay? And ask your brain to edit out the colors. You can't do that. You're going to see those colors. You can imagine what it would be like to have the red of the roses and the green of the foliage as shades of gray, which is more or less the way that non-human mammals tend to see these things. But you can't actually edit it out because your eyes are specialized enough and your visual system and your brain settings are specialized enough that you've pretty much stuck with that message, you see. So what the giraffe seems to be doing is it seems to be trading on the specialization of the carnivoran visual system, which is normally a good system because it detects motion, which serves the predator's interests. And in this particular setting, with a particular combination of tall, dense vegetation of a rather sticky, thorny, and bare type, plus the white network of markings on this remarkable giraffe, which is dark with a white painted overlay, you seem to have the potential, an unproven, untested potential for a very remarkable and specific kind of hiding. And as long as these ideas are not tested and not incorporated into our thinking of the value of conserving the reticulated giraffe, we're not really in a position to make judgments as to whether the hybrid might as well be as good as the real thing. You know, if it's too politically difficult to conserve the real McCoy, real reticulated giraffe in its politically challenging environment, there's a very great temptation psychologically to say, oh, well, you know, everything's variable and we don't really understand the species concept and we don't really know the origin of the Lycipia giraffes, and you know everybody's always called them reticulated giraffes, and they may as well be, and you know we've got to be realistic here, and so forth. And it's very easy to get to a situation where you just settle, and you say, oh well, we're going to have to lose those unambiguously reticulated giraffes, but at least we've got a nice population here in the Lycipia, and that'll have to do. And the same applies to the zoos. And now what you've got is a situation where, unfortunately, you're allowing the reticulated giraffe to slip into extinction. That may be unavoidable, but let's not do it unless it's completely unavoidable. Let us spare no effort in, firstly, understanding what we're about to lose, and secondly, putting the effort in to keep the real McCoy in its real heartland environment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Anthony, and thanks for that explanation and that theorizing. To think that we could lose that animal, you know, is tragic. But it hadn't occurred to me until now that we'd not only be losing that wondrous creature that's so enjoyable to look at, but we would also be losing this interaction between predator and prey. You know, we lose relationships between organisms. We lose concepts and events between hyenas and giraffes and lions and giraffes that is also tragic in its own way. It's not just the beauty of that animal that humans won't be exposed to anymore. It's the beauty of this interaction and the stimulation of this interaction between predator and prey that we'd be losing. And I don't think that's often taken into account when one thinks of the tragedy of extinction.
Well, that's true. And that aspect of the tragedy, of course, applies to all forms of extinction. I mean, any hemipteran bug that goes extinct tomorrow in the Amazon or any place on Earth gets lost together with all of its biological relationships. That tragedy is always accompanies extinction. But you see, we don't really care that much about some nuance of the, shall we say, the trophobiosis between a sap-sucking bug and a particular ant species, because there's so much of it and we can't keep track of it, and it would just dizzy us to care about every slightest regional nuance of something. But you see, when you lose the reticulated giraffe in its pure form, and along with that, all of its predator relationships, you're losing something that we should deeply care about.
Mm.
So because we relate far more strongly to big animals and carnivora and, you know, giant long-necked ungulates, we care about these things. Even people who don't particularly care about small fry in the range of extinctions that are happening across the world every day. I mean, if we were to think about this, we'd go mad as conservationists, because we're losing hundreds of species every single day, along with all of their wonderful biological attributes that we will never even know about because we didn't get a chance to study them. It's happening all the time on a vast scale, but we can't care about everything. Maybe we should, but we drive ourselves mad, partly because there's too much to care about, and partly because we know that we couldn't possibly be effective in trying to conserve everything. But when it comes, first of all, the tallest land mammal and a categorically different kind of a giraffe in terms of its appearance, and potentially a categorically different kind of a giraffe in terms of its relationship to habitat and climate, plus a giraffe that is adaptively peculiar in the way that we've been hypothesizing, there's something that we should care about and we should think we have a chance of keeping. Because if we can't keep that, what can we keep? What do we care enough to make the effort to keep?
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
And
carry on, Anthony.
Well, I'm just saying, I think most listeners will agree with the caring. Most listeners will agree that this is worth saving. And so one of the points of this podcast is to remind people that what is partly to blame for jeopardizing the future of the reticulated giraffe is a potentially unnecessary labeling problem.
Yeah.
You see, it's perfectly possible, if history had gone a different way, that this hybrid population, both in zoos and on the Laikipia Plateau, had been called a different kind of a giraffe. For example, on the Laikipia, it might easily have been called Rothschild's giraffe because it's about halfway in appearance between Rothschild's and the reticulated giraffe. And if it had happened to be labeled as Rothschild's giraffe, which is as logical as labeling it as the reticulated giraffe, people would take a different view, not because the scenario or the situation is any different, but because the labeling is different. So it's a psychological problem. It's a framing problem. And when you have this particular situation, this is the important rule of parsimony. To call that Laikipia hybrid population, the Rothschild's giraffe, brings no downside risk because there's plenty of other populations of the Rothschild's giraffe and they're just getting better all the time. The conservation prospects of that subspecies are improving all the time. It's a real success story in giraffe conservation. So mislabeling, shall we say that it's a mislabeling to call the Laikipia population Rothschild's giraffe because it's actually a hybrid. But that mislabeling has no penalty because it's not going to jeopardize the survival of the Rothschild's giraffe. However, it's asymmetrical because if you make the mistake of calling it reticulated giraffe, given that all of the real populations of the reticulated giraffe are in jeopardy, then that's a fatal mistake. Because then what you get is a false impression that there is at least one decent population of the reticulated giraffe. And in that complacency, you can easily lose the actual animal. So it's a kind of a rule of parsimony in which the downside of mislabeling that Laikipia population as the reticulated giraffe can make all the difference between survival and extinction of the actual unhybridized reticulated giraffe.
Right. It is correct to say that giraffes are the largest camouflaged animals on Earth, and then the reticulated giraffe is employing a particular type of camouflage not employed by other giraffes. So it really is an iconic animal that's being lost here, the largest camouflaged animal on the planet.
Well, the largest camouflaged terrestrial animal, because I think that one could call the whale shark camouflaged, and the whale shark is far more massive than any giraffe. The whale shark is camouflaged in the sense that it's got a system of pale dots on it. So it's the same kind of camouflage coloration as in giraffes, but on a much bigger scale. It's pale against dark, and it functions differently in seawater. But you can't categorically say that the giraffe is the largest camouflage-colored animal because it's terrestrial. But what you can say is it's certainly the largest land animal and certainly the largest mammal and certainly the tallest mammal with a coloration pattern that conforms in some categorical sense to camouflage. But then you also have to nuance that by pointing out that at least some subspecies and populations like the ones we've described from the Sahara and the Namib don't fit comfortably into the concept of camouflage because they live in such open environments, which are so often treeless, as you can see in photographs, that to shoehorn them into a general category of camouflage is to be a bit arbitrary and subjective, because there are definitely situations in which giraffes display themselves. They've got several features of their coloration, these other three species besides the reticulated giraffe, that actually announce the presence of the animal. I call these flag features. they're conspicuously pale or dark features that are accentuated by movement. And so giraffes have an intricate balance between an overall camouflage function and a subtle system of self-advertisement.
Yeah.
So you see, it's simultaneously true that you can generally say that giraffes are the largest terrestrial animals that have camouflage coloration, but it's also true to say that there are some interesting caveats to that. And then you can go on to say that if there is a particular giraffe that is most thoroughly committed to camouflage, the coloration of which has the least self-advertising aspects, then that would be the reticulated giraffe. So if you had to take the genetic claim that giraffes are the largest camouflage-colored terrestrial animals on Earth, if you had to take that and refine it and ask yourself which of the species of giraffes particularly lays claim to that distinction, it would be the reticulated giraffe. And so if we lose the pure reticulated giraffe, we're not just losing another species, we're losing what is more precisely likely to qualify as the specifically largest camouflage-colored terrestrial animal on Earth. And that's a pretty good distinction to lose with no battle. Let's fight for that animal. Let's fight to keep that creature, that Guinness Book of Animal Records kind of creature. It's a Guinness Book of Animal Records creature beyond its status as a giraffe. All giraffes qualify for the Guinness Book of Animal Records, but the reticulated giraffe is head and shoulders above the others in having additional qualifications. Let's not give that up, and let's not be misled by an unfortunate diagnosis of a hybrid population as the real thing.
Couldn't agree more, and thanks for explaining it. Fascinating and disturbing at the same time, and I do hope that conservationists globally will prick up their ears, and we as zoologists and wildlife enthusiasts across the world can start paying more attention to this animal and raise the required funds and start conserving it effectively. Thanks, Anthony.
You're welcome. It's been a wonderful chat, and I trust that listeners will have found it interesting too, and perhaps a little alarming in some ways, but at least informative. And please like, subscribe, and share if you really do like the show. And until our next item here on Exploring the Bio Edge, over and out from us.
Cheers. Thanks.